Good afternoon, sir. Can you see my screen there?
Yeah, it's visible very much.
Okay, good afternoon. Uh, Thanks for inviting me to the virtual conference. I'll be talking on the planning extremity amputations. I'm a prosthetic surgeon working at Base Hospital, Delhi Can, at the ALC, Artificial Limb Sub Center there. To start with, this is Dr. Ernest M. Burgess, the long posterior flap surgery we do in below knee amputations. He is the one who promoted it. He is the US orthopedic surgeon. His landmark paper in 1969 says that we need to create a dynamic and a sensory motor end organ, and we should stop all the atrophic wasted bony below knee amputations, which creates a problem in the rehabilitation of the patients. Most of these amputees were post World War II. They had a problem in making prostheses for them. That's when he promoted this. And amputation must be considered as a reconstructive surgery. That's the Seattle foot he is holding on his table, like our Jaipur foot. He also one of the pioneer who started the immediate post-operative prosthesis, the CAD/CAM system and all. Every talk on amputation, every patient where we think of amputating, we should first think about a limb salvage. The recent advances in the medical field in evaluation of a trauma patient or resuscitating and in the wound care will help us in salvaging most of the trauma patients. We can use a lot of free flap and soft tissue transfers to uh, to convert a above knee amputation to a below knee amputations and help us in salvaging some of the limbs, the interventional vascular procedures, and especially in bone tumors, the endoprosthesis, which the latest ones which are available have salvaged the limb. Limb salvage is the concept which evolved from the bone tumor surgeries. And the replantation of severed limbs also has to be considered before amputating. However, we should remember that a failed limb salvage or a salvaged useless limb can be devastating. So we should not delay the amputation sometimes, because as you see in this image, some reconstructive brilliant surgeon has salvaged the heel of this patient, but he will request you for an amputation when he cannot bear weight on his heel. Planning extremity amputations is a multidisciplinary. We should involve all the competent surgeons in our hospitals, the trauma surgeons, vascular surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, reconstructive surgeons. We should also involve the physicians, the endocrinologists, psychiatrists to optimize the patient before and after the amputation. The rehab team, after the stump is created, is a patient-centric, holistic, multi-pronged, and a goal-oriented process. In our hospital, all the people I mentioned here sit together with the patient and then plan the goals for the amputee patient. The prosthetic surgeon will be the center. He's the captain of the team, and the prosthetist is the heart of the rehabilitation process. So we should have along with the after a patient is amputated, we should have a good rehab team to put our patient back on road. Indications are amputation, all the 4Ds. This most of us know. Is amputation is a surgical failure? Definitely not a failure. It is a reconstructive surgery. A well-planned and executed amputation can remove a painful or a dysfunctional limb and allow a rehabilitation of the patient. Coming to the goals of amputation surgery, this is a Kargil war veteran, Major D.P. Singh. He's a blade runner. He's a marathoner. The goals of amputation surgery are not only to remove the infected necrotic tissue, provide pain relief to the patient, or a successful wound healing. We also have to look after the stump maturation, the prosthetic fitting, ambulation training, and social integration of the amputee. Coming to the siting of amputation. Before World War II, most of the amputations were above knee because there was a problem about the healing of the stumps. In World War II, most of the amputations were below knee because they noticed that the stumps would heal in the below knee also. In 1960s and 70s, when Dr. Burgess and his colleagues promoted the long posterior flap, which we most commonly do as a Burgess technique, the below knee is the most common amputation performed now. So what are the major problem when you do amputation is whether the stump will heal or not. So what are the predictors of stump healing? Most commonly, most of those who do amputations will know the bleeding on the table, the bleeding from the margins on the table, the healthy muscle, that is what will predict the healing of the stump. Some of the other parameters can be a segmental pressures using Doppler and TCPO2, transcutaneous pulse oximetry. The TCPO2 levels of around 20 to 40 is enough for a stump to heal. TCPO2 is measured by a probe put on the skin. It measures the oxygen tension which is emanating from the skin of the stump. Now, about how much bone should be salvaged. As you can see in this slide, the energy expenditure increases when we do a proximal amputation. The unilateral SIMS is 15% more than what a normal guy would spend. And the unilateral transtibial, the standard amputation which we perform in most of the cases, is 10 to 40%. However, if it is a bilateral amputee, you can see the energy expenditure is 123%. And if you go transfemoral, then it is 60 and 300%. So we should try and salvage the length we should go and do as distal as possible. Coming to the individual amputations, below knee amputations, I want to promote the knee joint preservation here. Preservation of knee joint is very important. The standard 12 centimeter below knee stump is what we promote for an ideal stump. But with the advanced prosthetics available and the advanced the suspension sockets and the silicone liner with a shuttle lock available, we can salvage the knee with 3 centimeter below the tibial tubercle also. That is 7.5 to 5 centimeters from the joint line. Saving the knee is economical for the patient and it is a less energy consuming also. Though it is a short lever arm, but still it is much better than going above knee. Save the joint whenever it is possible. Coming to the above knee amputation, the most important thing here is the flexors of the hip, flexors of the thigh, the iliopsoas is intact. Even when you do a above knee amputation, the abductors are intact, but the adductors are gone. The adductor magnus will be cut if you don't do a myodesis. So the most important step in a above knee amputation is doing a adductor magnus myodesis. Myodesis is done by drilling 4 holes in the distal femur, the anterior and 3 more laterally, and we have to suture the adductor magnus. We have to keep the adductor magnus little longer than the at the amputation level so that we can suture it to the bone under appropriate tension so that the adductor magnus works and keeps the limb in adducted position. Otherwise, the patient after amputation will have a circumduction gait with the prosthesis. Knee disarticulation, which went into disrepute after it was done in 1960s, is restarted again in modified Maget's technique. You can see in the image, it produces a bulbous stump. That was the problem with this, and the knee joints were also an issue. So it went into disrepute. Now with the advanced prosthetics again, what is recommended is a modified Maget's technique. In the modified Maget's technique, what they do is we have to shave the condyles using a osteotome or a oscillating saw and shave the patella from the quadriceps tendon, and the quadriceps tendon is sutured either to the hamstrings or to the posterior cruciate ligament. And the knee disarticulation is a end weight bearing, so it helps the patient in having a end weight bearing prosthesis. And one of the advantages of a knee disarticulation is the patient can perform his sexual activity because it's a end weight bearing also. Coming to the foot amputation, the minor amputations in the foot and in the midfoot and hindfoot amputation, this transmetatarsal is one of the best amputations because we have the dorsiflexors intact in a transmetatarsal amputation. However, in the Lisfranc and Chopard, your dorsiflexors are, if they are not reinserted, then we have a lot of problems. In a transmetatarsal amputation, we should keep the basis of the metatarsals intact because that is where our tibialis anterior peroneus or peroneae are inserted. Some of the bad amputations, the Lisfranc amputation, in which the procedures are not done, here the dorsiflexors are lost. So the surgeon who plans to do a Lisfranc amputation should lengthen the tendo Achilles, should plan a tibialis anterior insertion to either the navicular and the talus. Otherwise, if the dorsiflexion is lost, there is a equinus deformity and the patient will be walking on the scar and it leads to ulceration and it will be a bad amputation. So your peroneae and tibialis anterior has to be inserted and even you can do a ankle arthrodesis in these patients. That will also help the patients. The Chopard amputation, again, the problems is there is no tendo Achilles lengthening here. There is no arthrodesis of the ankle. So the axis of the movement will be a problem. The tibia will be jetting out of the scar and the patient will have a problem in rehabilitation. So here ankle arthrodesis should have been done or you should have gone for a proximal amputation. Symes, one of the best foot amputation, though ankle is lost, it's a end weight bearing prosthesis with a simple prosthesis which is shown here is an elephant boot. The patient can walk short distances without even a prosthesis here. It's one of the best for amputations for Indian settings, especially the rural ones. Coming to the foot amputations, if you are amputating a great toe for a gangrene, then try and salvage the proximal centimeter of the bone where the plantar fascia and the flexor hallucis is inserted. It helps in preventing the ulcer formation and further amputations. If you cannot salvage, then do a re-amputations. Re-resections are more durable than the transmetatarsal amputation, but there are certain rules in doing a re-amputation. The rule is hallux plus 1 lesser toe or a lesser toe plus 2. If they had to be done, then plan for a transmetatarsal amputation. As shown in this slide here, again the reconstructive brilliance. Somebody has just salvaged a great toe here. The patient is going to break it and will have to do a revision surgery or a proximal amputation in this first slide, which I've shown here, where we're planning to give him a A4, and it's a difficult rehabilitation for this patient. Again, here only one digit is salvaged. It's better to do a transmetatarsal. Again, this third photo, 3 re-amputations have been performed. It is not a viable option. We had to do transmetatarsal at a later time. Coming to the post-operative dressings, the amputation stump should be splinted with a well-padded rigid dressings to prevent joint contractions, which we've been doing in all the below-knee amputation. However, the latest things are the removable rigid dressings. This is one of my patients in the right side where I applied a removable rigid dressings. It costs around 80,000 bucks. I am reusing it for my patient. It's just easy to apply and remove. The problem with the rigid dressing is difficult to inspect your wound because it is difficult to remove your rigid dressing and reapply it. However, there are removable rigid dressings are also available. in which we can, the advantages of these dressings are decreased edema, less pain, and early prosthetic ambulation. I found a lot of advantages with the removable rigid dressings. Most of my patients' stumps mature within a month. This is the patient here. I used my early post-operative processes. He had a mangled extremity. He's a paramedic, so we had to do above knee amputation in this patient. This prosthesis is wearing is a early post-operative prosthesis. The immediate post-operative process which Dr. Burgess promoted was applied on the table itself. It's little difficult for the patients to bear weight on the third day and further ambulate on it. I found early post-operative prosthesis midway, where this patient 13th day I made him stand on this prosthesis. By 1 month, I sent him home with a temporary prosthesis. When he came back after 4 weeks, what he told me was that I didn't feel like I was amputated, because otherwise, if I sent him home with a stump, call him back after 3 months after a stump maturation, his problems would have been, all his relatives would have been crying on his stump, and the patient would have gone into some amount of depression, and I had to counsel him and then retrain him on all that. So it was a big advantage when I gave him a EPOP. I conclude by saying you're not disabled by the disabilities, you are able by the abilities you have. So that's where I conclude my talks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Actually, it was a very nice talk. I would say a very exhaustive, comprehensive coverage of all the levels of amputation. But you're not mentioned about forearm, anything in the upper limb. You don't get any patients about upper limbs.
So most of the upper limb ones goes to the plastic
Dr. Reddy?
surgeons. I just joined the prosthetic surgery 1 year back. So
Okay.
So that's the problem. So most of them go to a plastic surgeon or a hand surgeon.
Mhm.
So I'm not an expert in the upper limb. Please excuse me, I didn't even put some slides about that. I wanted to cover the key points in the lower limb amputations, because most of the PGs were attending it.
Yeah, but I think in the lower limb amputations, you have brought out the more significant and important points, the ones we should keep in mind. The good lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If there are any questions, can we open the questions, please, now?
I think let's first
I didn't
finish
get
the
anything on
talk
the
and
chat.
then take the questions.
I haven't got any questions on the chat box yet, but I think maybe if anything comes up, we'll let you know. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. Nice lecture.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Actually, Dr. Kamran sir also told what I was trying to.
I think Narendra, the next speaker is Dr. Dr. Captain Satish. Shashank, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Shashank.
Yes, sir, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Dr. Shashank, you are clear and loud. Please go ahead.
Okay. Because I was also expecting some prosthesis for the upper limb, because I'm a plastic surgeon, and now because the things are going towards hand rehabilitation, and then hand transplant has been done in the country. So I was hoping that we may be able to see some upper limb prosthesis, but a very good presentation regarding the lower limb prosthesis.
Thank you, sir. Group Captain Satish is expert in this prosthetic surgery. He's the senior most in the armed forces. He'll be showing you a lot of, we are using iLimbs and all in Artificial Limb Center, Pune.
Sorry to interrupt. We are already losing the time. So I request Dr. Shashank to invite next speaker.
So our next speaker is Group Captain Dr. C.N. Satish. He's the senior advisor of surgery, and specializes in prosthetic surgery. And he's also associated with Artificial Limb Center, Pune, 5 Air Force Hospital, and Base Hospital, Lucknow. Dr. Satish, please.
Yeah, thank you, Shashank, and I thank all the organizers to invite me. I hope I am audible, please. Can someone confirm?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
thanks a lot, ma'am. And a very good afternoon to all ladies and gentlemen, and greetings from Base Hospital, Lucknow, where I am heading the Artificial Limb Subcenter there. In this talk, I will clarify Dr. Shashank's doubts on the upper limb prosthesis also. How does this? Yeah. So I have been asked to speak on prosthetic considerations for amputees. And what Parmeshwar just before me had mentioned, a very unique thing that I'll point out is amputation is actually a reconstruction. Amputation is not end of the treatment for the patient, and the treatment continues, and the prosthetics is what comes next. And so I will start off saying that prosthetics is actually an art. What a very famous American athlete, actress, and model said that an amputation is actually creating a blank canvas where we can put in anything we want and we can do anything that we want. Amy Mullins is a bilateral lower limb amputee. She is a proud owner of 12 pairs of legs. You can see there are 5 of them here, and she's got much more after this. And what's really unique is that she can choose whatever height she wants to be. Imagine this, I mean, she can be 5'6" someday, or if she wants to attend a party, she decides she's going to be 6'2". I mean, how lucky they are. I'll give a very brief overview of the amputee rehabilitation, some general principles in prosthetics, cover lower limb and upper limb prosthetics briefly, some special conditions, and if time permits, something about the future of prosthetics. We in the Indian Army have been managing amputations, I would say, since more than 2,000 to 3,000 years. Just taking the credit from the Ashwini brothers, actually, who were the first combat prosthetists who had fitted Queen Vishpla with an iron leg when she lost her leg in the battle. But coming to more recent times, we have been dealing with prosthetics since early last century. In 1920s and 30s, our military patients used to be going through the civil to get their prosthetics done. And these are some of the bills dating from 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And you can see this, there was a shaped leg used to cost 115 rupees in 1940. And that translates to nearly a lakh now, I think. So anyhow, the armed forces has been at the forefront in organized prosthetic care with the Artificial Limb Center Pune established in 1944 and 5 sub-centers established all over the country. And the way we do it is that the primary care, that is immediately after trauma or the amputation, is given at the respective military hospital, followed by the follow-up care at the 5 artificial limb sub-centers distributed at Chandigarh, Delhi, Lucknow, Guwahati, and Bangalore. And the tertiary care is given by Artificial Limb Center Pune, which is the largest limb center in armed forces. So though my talk is on prosthetics, so I put in the slide just to say that prosthetics is not just the treatment for amputations. It forms just one small part of the treatment. What starts off with a proper surgery, then physical therapy, psychological support, and other things is more important than only prosthetics. So what is a prosthesis? I mean, if someone asks a PG student for definition, so this is a simple definition that one can give: an artificial appliance that replaces or compensates an anatomical loss. So basically any part of body which is lost, we are replacing or compensating for it in either a functional and or a cosmetic manner. Some of you may be familiar with Edward Scissorhands and the very famous Swiss Army hook, a totally functional prosthetic. Or you can have something that is very cosmetic but has no function. Or we can have something that has got both form as well as function, that is looks as well as functions, like a prosthesis. So what goes into making a prosthetic? To just break it down, the parts of a prosthesis, we said that we are replacing a lost body part. So if the foot is amputated, we replace the foot with the prosthetic foot. The leg is amputated, so we put in a shank. And in case the knee joint is gone, say in a through knee or an above knee, then we put in a knee joint. And all this is held on to the body with what called a socket. So the way we wear shoes, the amputee wears a socket, and socket is the custom made part in any prosthetics, and that is made with measurements of the patient. And then comes the suspension. Suspension is something that holds on the prosthesis to the body. So here we have shown one type of suspension. There are several types of suspension available, which is used for the patient to tie the prosthesis to his body so that it doesn't feel like a dead weight. This entire thing can be covered cosmetically to give it looks like a normal leg, so that cosmesis can come in. And sometimes we use special components such as a rotation adapter, etc., for specific needs of the patient. So these prosthetic components are classified according to various activity levels. So there are 5 different activity levels. You don't have to read the entire thing. Level 0 is a patient who will not benefit from a prosthesis. So basically, at best, he may have a cosmetic prosthesis. Suppose there's a patient who cannot get out of a wheelchair. He cannot use a prosthesis. So he may benefit only with a cosmetic prosthesis. A level 1 is a household ambulator. He is restricted within the house. He's not going to get out of the house. Level 2 gets out of the house, but for limited activity. Level 3 is a normal person, a community ambulator, and he goes to work, he goes shopping, etc. Level 4 is a highly active amputee, like a child or an adult or an athlete. So based on these levels of activity, there are a variety of components available in the market, ranging from a very simple knee joint, which has got a lock, or a knee joint with a brake, or going up to knee joints which have got hydraulics and pneumatics, and now you get even microprocessor controlled knee joints. So these joints have been classified according to various activity levels, and I'll come to the prescription in a short bit. Similarly, we have various types of prosthetic feet. Parmeshwar had shown one Seattle foot, which is a very cosmetic and a very nice looking foot, which is a solid ankle cushion heel foot. And so that could be used for a level 0 or 1 or 2 activity. And as the patient becomes more active, we can go for things like carbon fiber feet, which are actually energy storing feet. The point to note here is that the taller the foot, the more the energy it will be able to store. And this will come subsequently when we talk of the prosthetic fitment. In level 4 feet, ALC Pune was the pioneer in fitting the first blade in India. Some of you might be familiar with Major DP Singh, who is a marathoner. And this person on the right is Subedara Anandan, who is an Asian gold medalist in 200 meters. Sometimes we use rotation adapters, which can allow rotation. I'm sorry, the video is not working. Some last things. And we also have a teletorsion adapter. This is somewhat like a bike's shock absorber. And so whenever there is an impact, this picture is of a patient whom we wanted to do para jumps, and it did not happen, but we had fitted these shock absorbers so that when he landed on the ground after a para jump, the shock absorbers would have taken the shock absorbed in that. So based on these components, we have basically 2 types of designs. One is exoskeletal and other is called an endoskeletal design. The endoskeletal prosthesis, you will note here, the socket is mated to the foot through a tube. So this is a skeleton that is contained within the prosthesis once it is covered by the cosmesis, hence called as endoskeletal. So the point to note is that fitting this tube will require some amount of space. And so this amount of space has to be made available to the prosthetist so that he can fit these kind of feet to it. If this amount of space is not available, it will not be possible to fit any of these high activity feet. The exoskeletal prosthesis here, instead of that tube, we have a piece of wood or we have plastic. So these can be fitted even to long stumps. In case there's a very long stump where an endoskeletal cannot be fitted, then we can fit an exoprosthesis. But the issue is that none of the feet in the high activity types, such as the carbon fiber feet, can be fitted to exo design. So exo is not suitable for young patients who they want to do actually higher activity. So how do we decide on how to give a prosthetic prescription? When a patient comes, obviously he wants the best, and in his mind, the most expensive is considered the best. But it is not so. We do a thorough assessment. What is his patient's activity level before the amputation? Post amputation, what will he get back into, such as his vocation and recreation? What are the stump conditions, the length, shape, etc.? Whether there is any joint contracture, if there is any joint stability in the proximal joint, how dexterous the patient's hands are, because he has to be able to wear the suspension, take it off, and wear it safely. Is the patient cognitively good enough to understand, and is he motivated enough to get into this rehab? What is his medical condition? What are the tech resources, and that is in terms of manpower and equipment available in the limb center? And affordability. In our case, the limbs are sponsored by the government, so affordability is not a major issue, but we still use those 4 or 5 activity levels to classify and make sure that the patient gets what he wants and not necessarily gets what he deserves, not necessarily what he wants. Okay, coming to the level specific prosthetics, when we talk of 4-foot amputation, that is amputations of the toes and say transmetatarsal, we cannot have any of these carbon fiber prosthetics, etc. fitted, because that becomes very bulky. So we may go in for only toe filler, or we can go in for something made of silicone and a cosmetic prosthetics here. Coming a little more proximal, when it comes to hind foot amputations, these are not very good for prosthetic rehab, because when we do this hind foot amputation and the level of the heel is still maintained, that is the level of the sole is still maintained, and the prosthetic has to be fitted below that. So that takes up another 1 inch or 2 inches. And the patient then has to wear a shoe, that is another 1 inch. So this becomes a limb length discrepancy vis-a-vis the opposite side, the normal side. So on the normal side, the patient will need a shoe raise to compensate for this. So that's why this kind of things are not good. And also this tends to go into equinus very often. So this is another reason why I personally avoid doing hind foot amputations. A cheaper option is surgical boot, but that also has the same problem, that the normal side will have to be raised to compensate for it. Some very enthusiastic surgeons have sent us such cases wherein they preserved the part of the calcaneum, did a Pirogov. Pirogov, etc. was all right for the bygone eras when prosthetics were not good, but nowadays the prosthetics are much better. So I personally, in such a case where the ankle amputation has to be done, instead of saving the calcaneum, it is better to remove the calcaneum and do a Symes. Symes is technically more difficult, but you can see that good carbon fiber prosthetics are available for Symes, and good function is possible with Symes. And the Symes gives a very good advantage that the patient can ambulate within the house with having a weight bearing, without having to use a prosthesis within the house. Transtibial is one of the best amputations that one can do if one can manage that. Because a transtibial amputee has a near normal function. It is, I mean, that 10% energy expenditure that they have to do excess, that is very easily compensated, especially when you see the transtibial patients running. And I mean, I have patients who are even running full marathons, transtibial patients. Ideally, we recommend the stump length to be around 10% of patient side. So this allows us to put in this adapter here. So this adapter, if it can be fitted, then it is possible for us to fit any type of high activity prosthetics. Shortest, as Reddy has mentioned, distal to the insertion of patellar tendon. In the knee disarticulation prosthetics, the issue comes up is if the knee is disarticulated at the exact joint level, the prosthetics will jut out before that, in front of that. So what happens is, I mean, traveling in nowadays in the airlines, you can see even normal we people have so much of difficulty with those closely spaced seats. So traveling in a bus and airlines, etc., becomes very difficult for the amputees. And also, because this is jutting out so much, the lower portion will be smaller. That is, the shank portion will become smaller. In these cases, we prefer that a transcondylar be done so that this discrepancy is taken care of.
Dr. Satish, can I just interrupt and just ask you to conclude it in few more slides, please?
Okay, then I'll just rush through it. Then in the transfemoral, again, what I'll say is we have various options from locked knee going on to pneumatic knees and hydraulic knees. This one is the transfemoral with a hydraulic knee, and you can see a very good function is possible. Okay, Shashank, for you, the upper limb, there's always severe functional issues with upper limb. And the aim should be, I mean, the take home message for the upper limb prosthetics is restore function, not form. I mean, don't look at prosthetic options to get him to do things. Sometimes a very simple intervention, such as a clip here, this is a bilateral amputee, and a clip with a spoon made him independent within 5 minutes at a cost of 20 rupees. So in prosthetics, you have body powered prosthesis available. You have, you have myoelectric prosthetics available. We are using both of these. And this is a video of a myoelectric chap who's drinking water. But most important, irrespective of any prosthetics, is the training. Okay, so we give them a proper charted training and a graded training so that they become independent and productive members of the society. Okay, I'll rush through this also. This is the post amputation mobility aid. So early prosthetic rehab should be done within 3 to 5 days of the surgery. One should fit the early prosthesis. Cosmetic rehab is possible where functional is not possible. A very important thing for surgeons is that don't hesitate to do a skin graft. Even 100% skin grafted transtibial stump can be fitted with a good prosthesis and achieve a good outcome. So don't cut down on that stump length because of that. The shortest can be fitted with a shuttle lock. Sometimes innovative designs we have to do for congenital deficiencies. Most of the recreational sports can be taken part with normal prosthetics. But when it comes to competitive sports, then specialized prosthetics such as these blades are needed. And we are routinely doing them. And a word about non-prosthetic rehab. Sometimes prosthetics is not really essential for doing their function. So a person can achieve good function even without having a prosthetics. For in case this person, we did a Krukenberg and he had a good function that he was able to even feed himself normally. What's coming in the future? 3D printing, bionics, shape memory alloys, osseointegration. Okay, I have completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Satish, sir. It was a very good, it was a great presentation, and I hope and I'm sure all of the listeners would have got a great message from the presentation. But yes, the last part, the last slide was the best. That training is very important in rehabilitation of all these patients with prosthesis.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you?
Sir,
Satish, can you
close this session if there is no more questions? The next, over to you, Dr. Narendra, please.
I request Dr. Nikki Sabharwal ma'am to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Kapil.
A very good afternoon to one and all. I thank the organizers for having me as part of this wonderful Trauma 2020, and I congratulate them on organizing this virtual trauma conference. I also applaud them for including this very, very important session, ventilation for surgeons, in this trauma conference. This is very important and pertinent, especially because a lot of surgical patients require ventilatory support, and this has become more pertinent in the COVID era. The oxygen therapy and ventilatory management has become the mainstay, and it is a requirement that all the medical professionals who are working with these patients should know something about this. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kapil Dev Soni, additional professor in the Department of Anesthesia and Critical and Intensive Care at JP and Apex Trauma Center, AIIMS. And he shall be speaking on basics of mechanical ventilation for surgeons. Dr. Kapil, please.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you, organizers, giving me an opportunity to speak on mechanical ventilation for surgeons. So what I would be covering in this would be the basics of mechanical ventilation. I will not be going or giving very advanced information about ventilation. So what I aspire is that specifically this talk is focusing mainly on the registrars, residents who are dealing with critical ill patients of trauma or other specialties, and those patients, they are put on mechanical ventilation, right? So mechanical ventilation is one of the ubiquitous interventions these days, specifically in the era of COVID. It's been put left and right on the patients who are developing respiratory failure. In intensive care unit, this is one of the most common therapy which is employed on critical ill patients. So I start with a case, a 20-year-old case of multiple rib fracture getting treated in ward, suddenly becomes short of breath. He's tachypneic with fall of oxygen sets. He gets intubated and he requires to be connected to a ventilator. So the first thought which arises in a caregiver is why the patient needs a ventilator support. So if you look at overall concept of respiratory failure, there are primarily two basic respiratory failure, and then there are 3 and 4 which are additional respiratory failure, which are subsets. So the basic two types of respiratory failure are the hypoxic respiratory failure and hypercapnic respiratory failure. Hypoxic respiratory failure means inability to oxygenate the blood or the deficiency of oxygen in the blood, hypoxemia. Hypercapnic respiratory failure means increased carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and this happens because of failure of ventilation. So mechanical ventilation is a useful modality for patients who are unable to sustain the level of ventilation which is required to maintain the gas exchange. Importantly, two important functions. One is the oxygenation of the red blood cells, and second is the removal of carbon dioxide from the body. So it's a technique in which energy is supplied in a predetermined way to augment or replace the patient's muscles in performing the work of breathing. So these are the three important concepts when somebody is thinking of putting a patient on mechanical ventilation. First is the patient developing hypoxia, or is it a problem of carbon dioxide? Or is it a problem of work of breathing? It's inability to breathe. So this is the three important concepts when somebody is initiating mechanical ventilation. In both the type of respiratory failure, the abnormalities can be differentiated, and sometimes you will find patients with both the abnormalities present. Patient is hypoxic along with patient's inability to breathe. That is developing both type of respiratory failure. In hypoxic respiratory failure, the primary abnormality is at the level of alveolar capillary membrane or alveolar capillary interface. Common causes could be the pulmonary edema, contusions, pneumonia, ARDS, or it can be aspirations. In hypercapnic respiratory failure, it could be the abnormalities may lie during the ventilation pathway. That may be a central cause or depressed drive because of oversedation or because of overuse of opioids, or it could be because of the pump itself, that is the thoracic abnormalities, the cage, the impaired ventilation, multiple rib fractures, or it may be the development of effusion or empyema. So the causes may be varied for both type of respiratory failure. If you think about physiology of mechanical ventilation, what exactly is mechanical ventilation doing is it's providing a positive pressure during inspiration. So the initiation of a breath, the termination of a breath is either controlled by the machine or partially controlled by the machine. Or in some modes, it's totally determined by the patient, but support is provided by the machine. Okay, so the level of ventilative support may vary from a full support in where the work of breathing is essentially done by the machine, or in other case, it could be because of a partial support where the machine is partially supporting the work of breathing of the patient. So before thinking further about mechanical ventilation, this is basically for the residents, registrars, they should be familiar with the equation of motion. Equation of motion is nothing. It's basically a combination of three variables, which is the pressure, volume, and the flow of gas. And this is important so that whatever breath is being delivered by the machine reaches to the lung. So there is a physical formula where the pressure is determined by the volume divided over the compliance, added with resistance multiplied by flow. So this gives us a relationship between how does the volume changes along with the resistance and the pressure. So this is equation of motion. A typical breath, if you look at how during if patient is spontaneously breathing or a mechanical ventilator is giving the breath, how does it change? Pressure changes within the lung. So in this you can see. So this is what a normal spontaneous breath happens. Initially, there's a negative pressure generation, and then there is a breath, positive pressure. So this is a natural breath. On the other hand, a mechanical ventilator is giving a positive breath. Okay, it starts with the positive rise in the pressures, then it reaches a plateau, and again it remains above the baseline if there's an addition of a PEEP, and then it against the next breath. So there are multiple phases of a single breath. One is the initiation of the breath, one is the trigger, the initiation, the limit, and then there is cycling. Cycling means change of a phase variable from, say, from inspiration to expiration. So these are the various phases of a single breath, which is provided by the mechanical ventilator. So these are the phase variables. One must be aware how does the inspiration changes from expiration, what are the triggers, and how does the breath is stopped. So a change from expiration to inspiration is again determined by all these three variables along with time, that is the flow, volume, and the pressure. The inspirative phase, change from inspiration to expiration, and finally again the expiration. So these are the four components of a single breath or four distinct phases. A phase variable is a trigger, what causes the breath to trigger, that is from expiration to inspiration. Limit is what regulates the gas blood flow during the breath, how much the pressure may increase. There's a cap, there's a ceiling effect. So that is called as limit. And what are the variables which determines limit is again the three variables. And then there is a cycling. Cycling is nothing, but it's basically from inspiration to expiration. So modes of mechanical ventilation, most of us who are working in patients with trauma or patients who are critically ill, they are familiar with the mechanical ventilator, but we are also familiar with multiple modes which are there on the machines. Machine may vary from one vendor to another, but the basic modes remain the same. But then there can be the different additional additional modes or combination of modes which are available in specific machines. So one must be familiar what are the basic modes available, what are the advanced modes available, and how to operate these machines. So modes of mechanical ventilation is like this picture, where you can have one basic mode, and then there can be several additional modes, which are nothing but small changed modes, or the combination modes, or the dual modes with some sort of automation or a closed loop automation. So you will find these additional modes may have variable names in different machines, but as a physician, you must be aware that what actually is being happening with the patient and what actually the machine is doing. So addition of newer modes or newer names, there's no regulations. So you will find a same mode having different names in different machines. So what is a mode? Mode is basically how the breath is being delivered. It's a way of delivering a breath by a specific positive pressure. And a positive pressure breath is basically depend upon three things. That is the trigger, the limit, and the cycle. They are the phase variables. There are four things: pressure, volume, flow, and time. These are the only four variables which vary. So why we say variables? Because they vary. And you can actually control one of them. The other three would become independent. So if I say a volume control mode, then the volume is determined by you or by the machine. A machine is controlling one variable. On the other hand, the pressure, the flow, and the time within the circuit and within the patient chest cavity, they would become independent, and they can vary based on the patient's underlying chest condition. So which type of mode should we start a patient on? There are multiple types of mode. One is a mandatory or controlled mode. Then there are assisted modes. Then there are supported modes. And then there are spontaneous breathing modes. So as I spoken earlier, that a machine can provide a full support or a variable, just a support, a full breath or a supported breath, or it may allow the patient to spontaneously breathe. So based on this different circumstances, a machine can give a controlled breath, assisted breath, supported breath, and a spontaneous breath. So ideally, there are 5 basic breaths. If you look at based on different modes, a patient can have a control mode, assist mode, again assist mode, or a support mode. Just a play of 5 variables. One is pressure, flow, volume, time. These are 4 variables, and based on the combinations of all these 4 variables, different breaths are designed. A basic mode is the volume set or pressure set. A volume set or volume control breath means a specific volume of gas would be delivered to the patient, and that's been fixed. On the other hand, the pressure, flow, and time may vary. Whereas in a pressure controlled mode, the amount of pressure which can be applied to the lung is fixed, whereas the volume, flow, and the time that can vary based on the lung characteristics or the compliance and resistance of the lung. So a control mode or a continuous mechanical or a mandatory mode is basically when the patient is paralyzed, completely paralyzed during OR or during initial phase of intubation. What machine delivers is basically a continuous or controlled mode. So this trigger could be pressure trigger, it could be flow trigger. In certain machines, it could be time trigger. In a pressure trigger, machine senses there's a drop in the pressure within the circuit and it starts triggering. Machine is triggered to give a breath. Whereas in a flow triggered, machine senses reduction of a flow in the circuit and it starts giving a positive pressure breath. So just a mechanism how the triggering happens. In the limit variable can be what you have set on the machine. If you are working in a volume control mode, then after a preset amount of volume, the machine would stop giving further volume. So that is, it can be a volume controlled, it can be a pressure controlled. Just like a set pressure is achieved and then the machine does not give further breath. So that can be a limit variable. Sometimes in certain modes, it can be time variable as well. So what does it mean? The inspiration stops there, and this must be distinguished by the variable used to end inspiration, which is we call the cycling variable. A cycle variable can, again, it can be pressure, volume, flow, and time. These are only 4 variables in the ventilator. A variable that is measured to terminate inspiration and begin expiration is called cycle variable. And this could be time cycled, it could be a volume cycled, it could be a pressure cycled. So based on the combination of all these 3 things, trigger, limit, and cycle, one can look at whether the ventilator is giving a mandatory breath, is it giving an assisted breath, is it giving a spontaneous breath, or is it giving a supported breath. You can see. So most importantly, when I am looking at the patient, I would look at how the ventilator is doing a cycling. It's easy to do. If the patient himself is terminating the breath, either the patient is in a pressure support mode or patient is in a spontaneous mode. If the ventilator is cycling, it means either it could be assisted mode or a mandatory mode. Mandatory mode means if the patient is completely paralyzed. Assisted, otherwise it would be in assisted mode. So the best way to look at is how the ventilator is cycling and then to determine which type of breath is being delivered to the patient. So this is how the graphics change. These are called time scalers. There are 2 things. One is time scalers, other ones are loops. These are graphics which are displayed on the ventilators, and this as a provide a lot of information to the clinicians who are who's trying to synchronize the patient effort with the machine. So what you need to look at is the flow, pressure, and the volume. Volume would be always on the positive axis, whereas the pressure can be towards the negative axis as well. So as the flow, it can vary from positive to the negative axis. Let's look at how does it flow. This is an example of volume ventilation or volume controlled. Volume controlled means a set amount of volume is fixed. It gives you a preset volume. So it's a linear. Whereas pressure and the flow becomes dependent on the lung condition. And once they reach a particular level, the ventilator cycles from inspiration to expiration. So this is a volume ventilation. Then there can be a pressure control ventilation. In a pressure control ventilation, you are setting up the pressure. The pressures are fixed, what you can achieve in the patient lung. So the volume and the flow, they become dependent variable on the lung condition. So you can see the pressure is fixed. This is the flow, inspiration, and then this is the expiration. They can vary. you can see there's a variation in the flow because now these are dependent variables on the lung condition. Assist control, you can see what happens in assist control is there is a effort made by the patient, and this effort is sensed by the ventilator. It starts the breath, and this is how every effort is sensed based on the sensitivity, trigger sensitivity, and the ventilator delivers. So this is assist control. Then, so this is assisted mode. If you see a graphic where there is a small negative deflection in the pressure, so this is the mode is basically assist control. In a pressure targeted mode, again, there would be some negative pressures in the circuit that would be sensed, and it will deliver a pressure control sort of a breath. So this is how you can distinguish between a complete mandatory breath versus a assisted breaths. Then there are other modes like synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, where the machine is actually giving certain breaths, then certain breaths are also assisted and others are spontaneous breath. So you can see, you will find graphics in some sort of like this. There was a lot of variation in the breath types which are delivered to the patient. You have one ventilator triggered breath, then there are the spontaneous efforts. These are spontaneous efforts. This is how it happens. These are spontaneous breaths. So machine is allowing patients to have a spontaneous breath. That's why SIMV is also called a winning mode. So it can be, again, the SIMV can be a pressure targeted or a volume target, or pressure control or a volume control modes. Then there are other winning modes that include the pressure support mode and the CPAP. What happens in a pressure support mode is the breath is triggered. So the ventilator is just doing a partial function. It's just supporting the patient efforts. And the cycling happens by the patient itself. So the cycle, the expiration is determined by the patient itself. The inspiratory time is variable. So this is a pressure support mode. You can see again, there is a negative deflection in the pressure which is sensed by the ventilator, and the ventilator allows spontaneous breathing during the mechanical ventilation. So this is a winning mode.
Dr.
CPAP,
Kapil, may I just interrupt?
Yeah. I'm just finishing
Can
it,
you,
ma'am.
yeah, just can you sum up?
Yeah,
We
I'm
are short
finishing
of time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
there are numerous modes now available, and one should be familiar with the 4 variables, specifically the pressure, flow, volume, and time. These can be, again, understand the physiology of the patient, and based on the physiology and the condition, adjust the mode of the ventilators. And what pitfalls? Ventilator can be injurious to the lung also. So one should be very cautious, very careful when delivering mechanical ventilation or attaching some patient to a mechanical ventilator. You should be well versed with the injuries which can be caused on the mechanical ventilation. So step for novices: determine the oxygen required, set the PEEP, decide the mode, try the initial mode, winning modes. Unsure about the lung compliance, better to use volume controlled. When initiating a ventilatory support, a good way to start is to use assist control. You choose an assist control mode, set the tidal volume based on the body weight, ideal body weight. Auscultate once you put somebody on a ventilator. Monitor the ventilator with an ABG or a clinical condition. And in case of any confusion or help, just call for intensivist. Thanking you.
Thank you, Dr. Kapil. It's a very exhaustive topic, and there are books and books written on this, and he has done a pretty good job in trying to summarize, but you'll have to befriend your anesthesiologist to learn more about mechanical ventilation. You'll have to have a hands-on there. Okay, Dr. Babita, I welcome Dr. Babita, my co-chairperson, and she'll be introducing the next speaker.
Yeah, hello everybody. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers to invite me as a chairperson. It was really a pleasure to listen to Dr. Kapil. He, in a very easy way, he has dealt with a very difficult topic, that is mechanical ventilation. So now our next speaker is Dr. Richa Agrawal. She is working as additional professor at Jayaprakash Narayan Apex Trauma Center. And it's a pleasure to introduce, she has been our resident and now she is working in intensive care unit And she has a lot of publications, around 50 publications in various international journals. She's also a ATLS faculty, and she'll be talking about interpretation of ABG. So once we have ventilated the patient, it's very important to know whether we are ventilating the patients properly. And the arterial blood gas analysis will give a lot of information. So Dr. Richa, yeah, please go ahead and talk about the interpretation of ABG. Maybe it will be useful for surgeons because they are also managing HDUs and various places they are managing the patient on ventilator.
Ma'am, there are people who see the ABG even without ventilator. It's not necessary.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, yes. And it's very important to know about ABG analysis.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me all. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, much.
So I'll be starting with the interpretation of arterial blood gas. The moment we start this, the first question which comes to your mind is why ABG? Can't I manage a patient without ABG? Yes, you can, but to a certain extent. ABG supplements the clinical examination, but does not replace it. Mind it, you have to clinically examine the patient and then go ahead with ABG. The clinical manifestations of many patients may get delayed because they are compensating. And so the ABGs, they come very handy in these situations. Many patients, they have multiple disorders and ABGs can give an access to that. They give you objective values. So for example, if the patient is in lactic acidosis, you cannot say what is the lactate. The ABG gives you the precise values and the response to treatment. And it also aids in CPR, that is during the cardiopulmonary resuscitation. When you do not know when there is a sudden cardiac arrest, what is the reason? These come very handy. What are the indications? Normally people think that the ABGs are done only to see the oxygenation, but if that is not correct, you can assess oxygenation, adequacy of ventilation, lactate, various electrolytes, even blood sugars, hemoglobin, hematocrit, an iron gap, and osmolarities. All these can be seen through the ABGs and accessed through the ABGs. Just revising the normal values of ABG as we go ahead and do some examples. Normal pH is between 7.35 to 4.5, PaCO2 35 to 45, and reference is 40. Pa2, minded it is 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury on room air. You have to know what is the fraction of inspired oxygen whenever you're saying about the PaO2. Bicarbonate is 24 plus minus 2. Saturation is 97 to 99%. And base excess is 0 plus minus 2. Now, it is a very interesting concept, base excess, which is coming up these days. I want to tell what is base excess. It is the amount of strong acid or base which is required to restore the plasma pH back to 7.4 at a PaCO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury at 37 degrees Celsius. The normal value is minus 2 to plus 2 milliequivalents per liter. Now, all the variables in the ABG are not measured. Only pH, PaO2, and PaCO2, lactate, and electrolytes, they are measured. Others are derived. So bicarbonate is a derived value. Secondly, as I already said, always comment on the PaO2 in relation to the fraction of inspired oxygen. Normal PF ratio is more than 400. The approximate idea which you can get of PaO2, that is you multiply FiO2 by 5 and get the PaO2 values in the normal lungs. Now, what are the steps for ABG analysis? The first main step is check the validity of the report, whether the report is valid or not. How to check it? This table gives you a fair idea of approximate H ion concentrations according to the pH of the patient. So if you have a pH of 7.35 in the ABG, the approximate H ion concentration is 45. You put that in this formula, multiply it by the bicarbonate in the ABG, divided by the PaCO2, and the value should be equal to 24. If it is not, it means your ABG report is invalid or there is error in the ABG. There is no fun in examining the ABG further. So first check the validity. The second step is check whether the patient is acidic or alkalotic. If pH is less than 7.35, we know that the patient is having acidosis. But what kind of acidosis we can come to know by seeing the PaCO2 and bicarb. If the PaCO2 is more than 45, it is respiratory acidosis. But if the bicarb is less than 22 millikelins, it is metabolic acidosis. So this is quite easy. Similarly, when you see alkalosis, see the pH. pH is more than 7.45, it is alkalosis, we know that. See the PaCO2, if it is less than 35, then it is respiratory alkalosis. And if bicarbonate is more than 26, then it is metabolic alkalosis. It is simple till right here, no hard facts involved in that. Now the next step is to see whether there is an appropriate compensation, or if there is a compensation, whether it is acute or chronic. Now body has a huge capacity to compensate. Whenever there is an acid-base imbalance, the body tries to compensate. Besides the buffers in the blood, the two main organs are the lung and the kidneys. So whenever there's a metabolic acidosis, there is a patient who will hyperventilate, wash out the CO2, and there's fallen PCO2. When there's the alkalosis, there will be rise in PCO2. Similarly, opposite, when there's a respiratory acidosis, the lungs are not breathing fine. The kidneys, they will try to save bicarbonate in order to bring the pH back. And when there's a respiratory alkalosis, when there is hyperventilation occurring, the kidneys, they will lose bicarbonate and they will fall in bicarbonate. Now, this is just 2 slides. What are the expected changes and how to see what are the expected changes in the acid-base disorders. In metabolic acidosis, it is easy to remember. Remember that CO2 would be 1.5 times the bicarb plus 8, whereas in metabolic alkalosis, the CO2 will also go down. It will be 0.7 into bicarb plus 21. Now 1.7 is approximately half of 1.5, so it is an easy way to remember. And in plus bicarb is 8, and in the other, it is bicarb is you are adding 21 to it. This is regarding the metabolic primary disorders. But when you come to respiratory disorders, it is a bit challenging because the kidneys, they take some time to compensate. So it all depends whether it is acute respiratory acidosis or chronic respiratory acidosis. Why I want to know? Because the treatment is different. In acute respiratory acidosis, you want to intervene early. In chronic, the body has already tried to compensate. The patient will remain acidotic and he will be fine for another few hours. So lots of equation here, but easy to remember is this figure. You just have to remember this figure. Whenever there is a respiratory acidosis, it means when the CO2 is rising for every by 10 millimeters of mercury, the bicarbonate rises by 1 in acute conditions and by 4 in chronic conditions. Similar in respiratory alkalosis, when the CO2 is going down by 10, the bicarb goes down by 2 in acute conditions, and in a chronic condition, it decreases by 5. And similarly, the pH in acute conditions decreases or increases by 0.08, whereas in chronic conditions, there is less decrease in the pH. And whenever the pH is between 0.03 and 0.08 change, it means it is a partially compensated stage. Now coming to few examples. Before that, there is another important point which I wanted to highlight is whenever there is a metabolic acidosis, we need to know what is the anion gap. It is used to assess the acid-base balance in metabolic acidosis because there are 2 kinds of metabolic acidosis, high anion gap and normal anion gap. The normal anion gap is 12 plus minus 2, that is 8 to 14, and it has to be corrected for the albumin levels. Whenever there is a high anion gap, then we go to the next step, that is the gap-gap ratio. Now I'll start with the examples. First is a case, 25-year-old man who comes to the ED following a road traffic accident. He is tachypneic, he is tachycardic and hypotensive. The pH is 7.26. How do you start evaluating? First, you see the pH, it is acidosis. Yes, it is acidosis. The CO2 is less and the bicarbonate is less, it is metabolic acidosis. What is the expected PCO2, which I told the formula initially, that you multiply the bicarb by 1.5 times plus add 8. So it comes out to be 26 plus minus 2. The CO2 is at 31 here. It is approaching this value, that is 28. So it is a primary metabolic acidosis. Now it is a metabolic acidosis. I want to know the anion gap. Anion gap here is 21. So it is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis with obviously increased lactate. Second example, it is a 45-year-old male, case of perforation peritonitis following trauma. 6 post-op days, been admitted in your ward, is having a watery diarrhea for 3 days and vomiting. The ABG shows these values. How do you interpret? How do you go stepwise? Now here the pH is again acidotic. Again, bicarb is low. It is a metabolic acidosis. Expected CO2 is around 18 to 24. The PCO2 is 25 here. So it is a primarily metabolic acidosis. But here when I calculate the anion gap, which is sodium plus potassium minus bicarbonate chloride, it is 12.5, which is a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now, why do I want to differentiate between high anion gap and normal anion gap? Because the causes are different. When you're talking about high anion gap acidosis, the most important in the trauma settings would be lactic acidosis, which could be because of hypoperfusion, hemorrhage, or sepsis, and rhabdomyolysis. Then other factors which could be there in patients who have diabetes, like diabetic ketoacidosis, or in starvation ketoacidosis. So these 4 points you need to keep in mind whenever there is a high gap metabolic acidosis, and you need to treat accordingly. Whereas in non-anion gap acidosis, the 2 important conditions which we encounter are the patients who are having ileostomies and colostomies and high output fistulas, and also patients who have urethral diversions or pancreatic fistula. So if you have a non-anion gap acidosis, think of these conditions. Next patient is a 54-year-old male, case of road traffic accident. He with head injury on diuretics. He has been on ventilators for a few days. The ABG shows these parameters. Again, if I go by stepwise approach, it is alkalosis. Yes, CO2 is higher, bicarbonate is higher, so it is metabolic alkalosis. Compensation, if I see, the PCO2 is 53, which is near this. So it is a primary metabolic alkalosis. Now, what are the common causes in trauma settings? Patients who are in the ward having vomiting or overzealous NG suction, over diuresis, or patient having severe hypokalemia. So these are the clinical conditions which can lead to metabolic alkalosis. Now coming to another case, which is a 65-year-old male, road traffic accident, unresponsive, bradycardia with respiratory rate of 8. Acidotic, yes. PCO2 is on the higher side, it is respiratory acidosis. I want to know whether it is acute or chronic, because my management is going to change otherwise. The CO2 has increased 18. If acute, the pH should be 7.26. Our pH is 7.27. And if chronic, the pH would have been 7.35. So it is an acute respiratory acidosis. But I want to know, is there a metabolic problem too, or only my patient is suffering from acute respiratory acidosis? If I see the bicarbonate, the expected bicarbonate, according to this equation, should be 25.8 and ours is 26. So there is no additional metabolic disturbance. Coming to the last example, another important example, which we see a 25-year-old female case of polytrauma, tachycardic, crying in pain. And this is the ABG value on room air. If I see pH, it is alkalotic. Respiratory alkalosis is there. CO2 is less. Now acute and chronic, I can differentiate by seeing the pH. This is the acute respiratory alkalosis as seen by the pH, which should be like this. Yes. I want to know whether there is a metabolic problem too. Yes. If I see the bicarbonate has risen only by 20.8, which is expected, and the actual is 20. So there is no additional metabolic disturbance. The only problem is respiratory alkalosis. Now, problem is this, where you have defined through the ABG, that is, it is respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis. Now, what to do? So you should know what are the common causes of respiratory acidosis, which we see on day-to-day basis. The first is of respiratory acidosis. The common causes are hypoventilation, airway obstruction, rift fractures. The patients in the ED, they may have respiratory acidosis, which is because of this and which can be treated within a minute. And then spinal cord injury, head injury, and other opiate abuse. Last slide is because the causes of respiratory alkalosis. The patients who have polytrauma, they may be in pain, anxiety, they may be hyperventilating because of that. Then there can be other disorders like hypoxia, fever, or pulmonary edema or pneumonia. And then this can be ventilatory induced. So these are the causes of respiratory alkalosis. So by seeing the ABGs, you can define what is your metabolic condition, see the clinical differential diagnosis, and treat accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richa, for an excellent presentation. It's a very difficult topic, made very, very